Prof. Nicola. Thank you so much for coming to see us. Let's give her a warm welcome to Potchefstroom.
Evening, everyone. So it's lovely to be here. Thanks to Simon and Nell for hosting me, and for Dian for driving all the way in and all the way out of Johannesburg. I really appreciate it, and obviously also to Christo and Henri in their absence. Before you flee, I know this topic is not exactly what you were given. So I am going to talk about politics. That is politics, and I'm going to talk about the upcoming elections. But I'm going to come in from a side angle, and you're going to see what I mean when I get there. So nobody flee. I can hear I'm really like I'm contesting with a party going on over there. And you know, I mean, it always surprises me when people come to hear a topic on politics. But so thank you for being here. So in the academia, we always start with, how many of you are at Potch? Okay. Yeah, at the university, sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. At the university, I know you're from Potch. How many are from the University of Potch? Let me clarify. Okay, so there's a number of you. Okay, a number of you have studied or are involved in that. So you will know that when you start with especially with our postgraduates, we always start with a problem. You know, what's the problem? And then you work from there. So it's not interesting unless you're actually working towards trying to understand something, trying to unravel it. So what is the question? What's a problem? And one of the problems is that when you turn 40 and you go older, you actually start losing your sight. So I'm going to be going, so that's another problem, but I'm just going to add to that. So what I'm going to look at is what is a problem, and then what makes for a flourishing society. And why is this important is because when you're evaluating the different political parties, hopefully we are looking towards a flourishing South Africa. So what makes for a flourishing country, and which political parties are actually standing for what makes for a flourishing society? So these are some of the tools that I'm hopefully going to share with you. So the problem. What is the problem? So what we're seeing are symptoms in South Africa. Large-scale corruption. Public funds have been used to pay for private weddings, private homesteads, first-class plane tickets, bodyguards, flashy cars. 50% of our water is not fit for human consumption. Our trains do not run. They actually started running again. So I don't know if you noticed that, but the trains after the lockdowns just stopped running, and we would like see a train, we're like, stop everybody. What's that coming along? It's a train. So the trains are starting to run again, but they haven't been running for a long time. We've got load shedding. We have just gone up to 33% official unemployment, but unofficial about 40% unemployment. It makes us, I think we might be the highest levels of unemployment in the world. If you start telling people these levels, they actually cannot begin to believe the types of levels of unemployment that we have in this country. It's a massive issue. It's probably, and it's also, when the surveys show that for South Africans, it is the number one issue for South Africans, is employment and getting employment. Because it's actually downstream from employment is poverty. But it's first of all is the employment. Human trafficking, rape, mass poverty, murder, etc., etc. So what is the problem? Those are the symptoms. Those are the symptoms. Well, what's actually the problem? What's underlying what we're seeing in our society? So depending on the worldview or the lens or the approach or the ideological or the philosophy that you approach, you will evaluate these symptoms differently. You will see what the key problem is from a different perspective. So if you're coming from a Marxist perspective, Karl Marx would say the problem is capitalism. So everything that we're seeing today is because of capitalism, and it's because of private property ownership. And so what he sees is the key problem is the economic or the external. if we can just change the external structures, so if we can just create a classless society, if we can just level everyone out, we just take everybody's property and we just create this incredibly benign state and then we hand out to everybody, what's actually going to create is you're going to create social harmony. So the problem is the external, we change the external and then you'll have social harmony and everything's going to be fine. So I want to argue that that's not a Christian perspective. What does the Bible say the problem is? In Romans 3, verses 22 to 23, it says there's no difference between Jew and Gentile, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So the problem, according to us as Christians and according to God, is that we are all sinful. All of us. We all fall short of the glory of God. And if we move from that point of departure, how do we evaluate what the solutions are? How do we address it? If this is the inherent problem, is that we are fallen and we are sinful. Fortunately, we know that there is a solution, and the solution is a divine Savior. Romans 3:25, God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. So the problem is not our external environment. The problem is internal, and the problem is our sinful nature. So when Jesus came and he died on the cross, the Jewish zealots at the time, they were waiting for the Savior to come, but they were waiting for a Savior to come on a steed, and he was going to come like with smoke billowing from his nose, and he was going to come with a sword, and he was going to vanquish the Roman authorities. That was their idea. That's what they wanted. They wanted the Savior to come and overthrow the Roman authorities because it was a deeply oppressive system. So the Jewish people had no rights. They had no recourse to law. They could be done to with impunity, whatever the Roman authorities wanted to do to them. So they were looking for the Savior to come and vanquish the Roman authorities. But what does Jesus do? He comes and he actually allows himself to be falsely accused and then to be crucified. And the crucifixion was the type of death that was reserved to slaves. It was the most contemptible form of death. And so you go, well, what happened there? Why? He could have vanquished those authorities. He could have done it, but he didn't. Why didn't he do it? Because he had a long-term goal in mind. Much larger, much wider, which would extend and have implications to where we are today. So if he had vanquished those authorities, that external environment, it would have been for a moment. And he could have done it. But what he's done is something so much more potent in terms of redeeming us from our internal sinful nature. But in doing that, he then sends us out into the world and then into the institutions. So it's an inside-out rather than an outside-in approach. So the solution is not man, the solution is God. Socially and politically, the answers are therefore in his word and in his ways. So I'm in the academia, I'm in the social sciences. Some of my friends are my colleagues who are in different faculties. They say that they feel nervous coming into our faculty. I said, you don't have to worry. But sometimes, do you feel like this, that you feel like you're an alien in this world? You're like foreign? You feel foreign in this world, and sometimes I feel foreign in the environment in which I find myself. So it's like going into Babylon. So I prayed about it, and the Lord gave me the word. How do we respond in an environment in which we feel so very foreign in? And so the scripture is from Jeremiah 29. So I want to read this for us. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. How beautiful is this? Build houses, settle down, plant gardens, and eat what they produce. And okay, obviously the in brackets is mine. That speaks to economic flourishing. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. My husband would be very proud of that one. Those of you know this, what he speaks on. Social flourishing. Also, seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. And this speaks to the political flourishing. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. So it's a call to actually, and that was for me also being in an environment, I'm like, is this where I need to, as a Christian, expend my energy and my time inside what is essentially Babylon? And here is a scripture which actually says to us we should establish ourselves in the environments in which we find ourselves. And we should seek its flourishing. So I want to take this into South Africa. What are we here for if we are not here to see the flourishing of the country in which we find ourselves? So, and then again, to go to the word, what brings flourishing? What brings human flourishing? What brings economic flourishing? What brings social flourishing? What brings political flourishing into the place in which we find ourselves? And it's an amazing orientation, because then you start to look and you see the people you work with, you want to bless them, you want to see them prosper, you want to see the environment in which you are in prosper, you want to see your colleagues prosper, your friends and your family and your country prosper, and then we are to pray for it as well. So, let's start with what is meant by government. So if I say government, what comes to mind? You can just throw the words out. Leadership, authority, nice. Corruption, yeah. Taxes, taxes, law, justice. So, I mean, we can be aspirational as well. Okay? Anyone else? Kind of quiet at the back? No one? Good. Okay, so authority, leadership, taxes, corruption, justice. So what we tend to think of when we go government is we tend to think of our state structures, a little bit of justice, so your legislature, your executive, your judiciary, the president, the legal system, the laws, the taxes. But did you know that idea of civil government, in terms of government incorporating civil government, is a fairly new idea. So in the early dictionaries, I think it was 1828, Noah Webster, he defines government as control and restraint. And then he starts with the control and restraint of your own emotions and your behavior. Then he goes into the organizing and of your family government. And then only later does he go into the structures of government, civil government, and they define it as civil government. Up until World War I, when you spoke about the state or civil government, it was always prefixed with the word civil. Thereafter, that word fell away and it just became government. And for me, this is really symbolic of what has started to happen, and we see, but it's not actually new. Although the idea of civil government is fairly new, the idea of this overarching state controlling all aspects of society is not progress. It's actually regress in terms of your old societies, your ancient societies, and I'll get to that. So this is God's government. Very different from the idea of just this overarching state or civil government. It's a recognition of what Abraham Kuyper, a Dutch theologian and also for a time the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, that was in the 1900s, what he speaks about as sphere sovereignty. So government, in terms of God's government, is it starts with God. God reigns. It's God's kingdom. He's in control. But because he's just benignly good, he reigns sovereignly. So he doesn't need us to input. He's completely in control. He reigns without our input. He reigns autonomously, independently, and his reign is unlimited. But then he does an amazing thing, is that he actually delegates authority to us. So authority was a perfect word because that is government. He delegates into different spheres authority. But remember, we said, what is the inherent problem for us is that we are all sinful. So he knows this. And in knowing this, what he does is he limits the authority. He never gives one institution absolute authority because he knows of our sinful nature. He knows what he does. So what our hearts tend towards. So we've got human institutions, authority delegated by God. So human institutions are dependent, they delegated, limited, and they are accountable to God. So all of these spheres of sovereignty are actually accountable and sit under God. So family government. So I'm not going to go into the family government, but there are various scriptures which speak about family government. Family government is marriage, raising children, and this needs to be important. This needs to be said because this is changing. Civil government does not establish or define marriage. God defines marriage, and it's in the Word. So the family is responsible for the welfare of family members, including the education of our children. That might be we delegate it to schools or we homeschool, but the responsibility of educating the children and what is inside there is the primary responsibility of parents. It's our responsibility. We raise our children. And we have been given that responsibility, that government to govern and have authority in our families over which the civil government does not have authority. And so what we're seeing now with what the Bella Bill, which is now unfortunately a Bella Act, is deeply problematic, where it starts to intrude into an area which is not a God-given delegated area for them. So now starting to control the curriculums of what's happening in your homeschooling environments is deeply problematic. So in some of these countries, like in Sweden, you are not even allowed to homeschool anymore because you cannot control a society if you cannot control the education system. And this is the point. So in Sweden, we had friends who had to leave because their one child did not fit inside the schooling system, and they had to leave because they were not allowed. They were not allowed. The state says to me, you are not allowed to homeschool your children. That is a complete out of the lane of what is actually civil government and the role of civil government. Okay, church government, in the same way, the church government has ecclesiastical rules and guidelines, and they hold the keys to heaven, they share the word. But again, it's the elders and the church which is responsible for doctrine. It is not the state. And so where we're seeing these rather euphemistically termed anti-conversion laws, it's about actually intruding into doctrine and what's happening inside of churches. But that's not their government area. That's not the authority that has been given to them. Okay, so church government, market. Market is interesting, and we're going to get to this when we get to economic flourishing. For those of you who's in business, a couple of you in business, great. Very, very important role in society. Again, the state does not create jobs. This might be for some, so when our current government says, no, we are now going to create jobs, we are going to create more public sector jobs, I just want to say that's not creating jobs. That's redistributing taxpayers' money. And it doesn't grow an economy. And the only way we're going to create jobs is if we grow an economy, and that is grown through business and not through the state, okay, or the civil government. And underlying all of these is self-government. So it's always internal first, and that's what Jesus did on the cross. Because these are the prerequisites before you can go into any of these other forms of government. How do you manage your family? We can see this in the Word. How do you manage yourself? How do you manage your conduct? And if you cannot manage those things, how do you manage your finances? Imagine if we started to look at our leaders before we elected them and we looked at their finances and how they managed their household. Imagine how different this country would be, that those were prerequisites. So Proverbs 4 verses 24 says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. And that's why self-government is critical and the bedrock of all the other forms of government. Okay, so I wanted to start with that just to position where does civil government sit, and before I go into the different ways in which we can see flourishing. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to show you some academic studies. So the beauty of being inside universities, so you know what the telos of a university is? Well, it used to be. Telos is what is the purpose of a university? Is to seek truth. They're supposed to be truth seekers. And what is happening is that universities are being shifted, the telos has been moved from truth, seeking out truth, into becoming social activists. So instead of exploring what is, so we can understand society, so we can improve society by looking at the empirical research, we are now moving into prescriptive ideologies and prescribing what society should look like, whether that has any form of empirical basis or not. So the beauty that I still see inside of a university is that we are still truth-seeking, and if you delve enough, you're going to get to the designer, and you're going to get to the ultimate capital T for truth. Okay, so I'm going to look at some of the research out there. So this is a spoiler alert. If you know academic writing, it's actually quite boring. It is especially boring because what we do is we always give you the solution or the answer or the finding right at the beginning. So if you like, you know. So if you want to read it, then it's just you just read the abstract and it's there, done. Okay, don't say that I told my students. Don't tell anyone. But it's that the answer is always right there in the abstract. We give you the answer, and it's super boring. So there's no kind of tension. Where's this going to go? You know, where's this going to lead to? We'll give you straight up in the front. So again, spoiler alert. So with each one, I'm going to give you the answer straight up. So once you're done, you're fine. If you want to go, I'll just pop it straight there. So, okay. So economic flourishing, work, stewardship, and property. So this one is when I presented this, I presented with my husband, and he does the economic side. So I'm just putting a disclaimer out there that this is his side, so it's not my strength, it's his forte. So firstly, what is man's answer in terms of economic flourishing? And this is global. So it's not just in South Africa, but globally you start to see where does the solution come from, and it's the state. The state somehow must make us all happy. The state needs to be the one that does the redistribution and the social spending. So initially you might think, well, that sounds nice. Why would it not do that? But we've got this idea that the state is somehow this Father Christmas, this benign Father Christmas with a goodie bag. But it's an endless goodie bag, and you just keep coming in and you keep handing out the goodies. To whoever needs the goodies, I keep handing it out. But we're forgetting that goodie bag actually comes from somewhere, and it comes from taxpayers. So in South Africa, we have a population of about 62 million. We have, at the moment, about 9% of the population which earns enough to pay personal income tax, which translates into what is about 9% of 62 million. It's just about 5 million, just under 5, around 5 million. 5 million actual personal income taxpayers. Our income tax contributes about 40% to the budget of this country, so it's an enormous percentage. So you're looking at less than 10% that are actually contributing to that. And what is happening is we have got approximately 16 million receiving social grants, and we've got a ratio of 3 to 1. It doesn't take much to realize that this is not sustainable. And the levels of social spending are not, and we're not growing the economy because of the stifling of the private sector. Where are jobs created? Where does you find, what is the engine room of job creation? Small, medium enterprises, smaller businesses. They are the engine room of creating jobs. And this is our number one problem in South Africa. Almost 40% unemployment, the number one need and desire of South Africans. And yet we are stifling that. We should be opening up. So also the research shows, where does economy grow? Economy also grows where the property is protected, property rights. So what we need to be doing in South Africa is not taking away property rights. We need to be extending property rights. And this includes giving people access and ownership to land, so that also in the communal areas, so that they are not beholden to areas, because if they leave, they don't have access to that land, but giving them ownership of that land so that if they want to move into urban areas, they have some kind of basis in which to actually build their own businesses or their homes and so forth. So property rights, this is again in the literature. The word is also quite clear that if a man does not work, he shall not eat. And we've been given stewardship and dominion. So often, and I've also heard it from some of my students, there's this thinking that's come in is that work is a burden. And she's like, there was a word that I can't even remember, but I'm not going to be like a laborless person. So I'm not going to labor. I'm not going to work. And I'm like, I wonder how it's going to go with your honors. Who's going to work for you? Who's going to get those marks for you? How's it going to happen? And I just want to say that work is a blessing. It's actually amazing because work is also human dignifying. And that's why South Africans want work. They want to be able to work to actually provide for themselves, to provide for their families. But it also means it cuts the ties between us and the public sector or the state. When we work, we have a level of independence. And this is also important in terms of, if we think of our human nature, how do we keep accountability? Well, you actually have to have independence between these different spheres so that you can actually hold them accountable, because we are all inherently sinful, and that gives that. So I'm busy listening to, I do audiobooks to a book called The Book That Made Your World, Mangalwadi, and he's in Michelle Mangalwadi. He's an Indian theologian. Anyone else heard of it besides Simon, who's read everything? Anyone else? Please have a listen. It's really, really fabulous. And he speaks about like the monastery, like the people who worked in the monasteries, like what were they, monks, and how they distinguish between toil and work. That actually toil comes from the fall, but work comes from before, that God actually blessed us with dominion. And having dominion is going to take some work. So they said what you saw is when they realized this, that actually they started to innovate. So they started to use the wheel. So instead of lugging one thing to the other side, you put it in a wheelbarrow and you use a wheel. So instead of using 4 people, it's just 1 person. And instead of having to go and collect water, you start to use troughs to get the water. And so this innovation started to happen because it's human dignifying, recognizing that we can actually use our innovation and our creativity to make our lives a little bit easier. So this is what my husband does. Maybe let me first describe this. So there was this a political economist. His name was Thomas Malthus. And he developed this theory that we were going to become overpopulated. So I'm trying to see which year he was. He was in the 19th century. And he said that we are becoming overpopulated and we're going to run out of resources. So he created this very dramatic fear narrative that we're just overpopulating. And that was 19th century, and I can't remember how many years. He said later that we would all run out. So there was someone who contended with him. His name was Simon, and he developed the Simon Abundance Index. And it measures the change in abundance and resources over time. So this was measured between 1980 and 2017 in terms of resource availability. So what he actually found was as population increased, so did resources increase. Remember in that scripture in Jeremiah says, don't decrease, increase. Because what happens is we are creative, made in the image of God. We are creators. We innovate. And so in the innovation, so you take something which is let's go with coal. I know it's not a popular one, but if you take something like coal, when it's in the ground and it does nothing, it means nothing. But if you take it out of the ground and you burn it or you turn it and you use it for fuel and you create electricity, all of a sudden it becomes something incredibly valuable. And what was the change? The change was the creation and the innovation. But the only way you get that is if you have people. So the more people creates more innovation. So what the Simon Abundance Index found, that between 1918 and 2017, resource availability increased at a compounded annual growth rate of 4.32%. That means that the earth was 379% more abundant in 2017 than it was in 1980. 379% more abundant. At the same time, the population had increased by 69% over that period, from 4.46 billion to 7.55 billion. So instead, we need to start seeing what does it mean to be creative and what releases that creativity. So the Malthusian thinking works in a controlled society. So if you have a society, for example, the Soviet Union or with Communist China. So Communist China at the moment uses a bit of a capitalist system, so you see the growth. But when you have a controlled society and you don't allow that innovation, yes, the population growth will actually lead to running out of resources. But when you have a society which actually opens and allows for people to do, especially those who have that entrepreneurial, you know those entrepreneurs, they're just so positive. You're just like, they don't stop. You're just like, how can you be so positive? They just see big pictures and they just keep going and their business fails and they get up and they start again. They've just got something incredibly special in there. But you need an environment which is going to release that, because that innovation, that creativity is what actually produces growth and resources and increases resources. So this is what we actually need in South Africa. We need to release our innovators and we need to release our entrepreneurs, which means we need a free market. Not popular at the moment, but it needs to be said. The other concern with this is in terms of your spheres of authority, is we've gone and we've grown into this idea of the omnicompetence of the civil government or the states, as if the state inside of it knows everything and can do everything. Where the reality is that knowledge is dispersed. So Thomas Sowell speaks about knowledge dispersion. That in society, we all know a little bit of something, and we're all quite good at something, but we're not good at everything. But there's somehow this expectation that inside the state, it's that goodie bag. As if the state inside there is all knowledge and they can do everything. And so that is also one of the problems why we actually pull everything into this one form of government as opposed to dispersing it. Okay, so that was economic flourishing. How do we see economic flourishing? Well, through work, through stewardship, and through property and protecting property rights. Social flourishing, again, here's your spoiler alert, families, and again, perhaps not a popular topic, but sexual restraint. And I'm going to show you some of the research on this. So what does the world say? What is their solution in terms of social flourishing? Man's answer to social flourishing is, let's upturn everything. Queer theory is critical theory applied to gender and sexuality. So I will do more of this tomorrow morning for those of you who are around. But what is queer theory? It's norm shifting. So that term also can be queering. I'm shifting norms, I'm queering it. The complete transformation of the society and the rethinking of intimate relationships completely. So it is aimed at the deconstruction of all norms. Foucault is key in this, and he was an advocate of, and again, I'm going to get to this, but this may be just a little bit of where I'm going to go, an advocate of intergenerational sexual liberation. Now, let me give you one word for that. It's called pedophilia. It's allowing adults to access children for sex So it's all about liberating, and that society is actually too controlled, and we're actually oppressed, and children are really oppressed, and they should be liberated, and we need to queer everything, and we start that with the education, and we need to have sexual liberation. So to queer means to disrupt. So you're dismantling male-female binaries. It now can be a social construct. You disrupt heteronormativity. What does that mean? Disrupting marriage between a man and a woman. You disrupt family. And then dismantling the child-adult, that intergenerational sex binary, which is pedophilia. So, okay, is this relevant to us? Okay. This is coming through in our education system. This is the Department of Basic Education. This was presented last year at one of the portfolio committees. Now, one would expect, if you're going to be on a portfolio committee, which kind of obviously mirrors the Ministry of Education, that when the Department of Basic Education comes and presents it, you're going to expect them, they're going to speak about the mass curriculum and perhaps, the debating curriculum, what's going to happen with debating between the schools, or the latest what needs to be doing in terms of physical education. But no, they came with this. It's really, really quite strange. So they came with this. It's called the Outline of Social Cohesion Programs. And I'm going to read the problem statement. In a country that needs consolation and unity, we cannot be underplaying issues of race, gender, and sexual diversity. Our intention is not just to teach children about issues such as xenophobia, femicide, and homophobia, but also the subtle images and messagings in the texts and social practices that communicate prejudice, which must be addressed. It is through pedagogies, as forms of teaching, of discomfort. Can you hear it? Queering. Pedagogies of discomfort, that we deepen our respect for diversity, equity, and freedom towards social cohesion and nation building. This is the curriculum for basic education that is coming in. And at the top is interesting because it says there, every child, can you see it, is a national asset. There in that small writing. This is the Department of Basic Education. I trust that all of us as parents will object. My child is not a national asset. My child is under my authority as a parent. They're my child and they don't belong to the state. But can you see this creeping that happens subtly in terms of creeping into our environments and into the lanes of other forms of government and here into the parent government? So a new development, which is also happening now, is called the Department of Basic Education, Early Childhood Education. And this is actually an international export coming in from Belgium. And it's millions that they've popped into this curriculum, this toolkit, the VVOB SA. You can have a look, and if you look at this, I'm going to read from them. This is what they say about this toolkit. Part of it has been test run in KwaZulu-Natal already, and when there was massive objection. So the religious communities, and that's Christians, Muslims, Jewish communities got together representing, I can't remember how many million South Africans, and said that this is not in line with South African values. They said, no, we're going to continue doing this. They just completely disregarded their input. So this is what this book says. Research shows that the concept of gender takes shape between the ages of 3 and 7. 3 years old and 7 years old. By the age of 7, gender identities form and stereotypes become set. Early childhood education, therefore, holds exciting potential to develop in learners a gender-sensitive view of self and others, impacting on their self-expectations and the choices they make in their lives for themselves and others. In other words, gender-responsive pedagogy in early childhood education could be key for young children to develop to their full potential according to their unique and valuable talents and interests, irrespective of their sex. So Karl Marx said that the child is like clay and malleable. And this is exactly what this is. If you can get to a child between the ages 3 and 7, you can bring in massive gender confusion. Again, this is not the responsibility of the state and is a complete intrusion into gender formation and affirmation, which comes from parents. So this is probably going to be a bit small, but the reason why I put it there was so that you could actually, I was just going to show you this, and you can have a look at it. So this is Freedom of Religion South Africa for SA, and what they have done is they've actually created a government department religious freedom scorecard. So you can see like inside what is happening inside the different departments inside government. And here we've got a couple from the Department of Education. So we've got this SOGI-esque guidelines. We've got this ESC toolkit, and you'll see for many of them what they've done very cleverly. With policy is we're supposed to have, like we did with the Bella Bill, but even that was not really considered the public hearings. You're supposed to have public hearings when you're changing policy, but what they're doing is they're circumventing it, and there isn't actually public input. And when the public then says, well, we want to input, they are ignoring them. So this has been driven inside of our basic education systems. Okay, so it's disrupting. Okay, so this is a postmodern building. So if we think about postmodernism and what is queer theory, it comes out of postmodernism. So it's that disrupting of norms, it's deconstructing. So this is a postmodern building. Anyone want to hazard a guess what the foundations look like? Sorry? Probably square. Probably pretty standard. The kind of, those of you in engineering, you're not going to build a building on, anyone going to build a building on postmodern foundations? Anybody going to go into a building built on postmodern foundations? No. And, sorry? Not willingly, not willingly, not willingly. So this is a picture of what is happening in society, and yet we are trying to build societal foundations on postmodernism. What, on the other hand, actually makes for a flourishing society? What are those foundations that through the years have been tried and tested and actually have empirical research to show that they lead to flourishing societies? So God's answer is families and sexual self-control. Families are the foundation of societies. And I think this is from you, Nell. It doesn't take a village to raise a child. It takes a family to raise a village. The empirical data shows that two-parent families are beneficial for children. Empirical research. Outcomes in life are profoundly shaped by their family and home upbringing. Two-parent benefits mean there are more resources. The kids do better at school. The girls are less likely to fall into teen pregnancy. Boys are less likely to become involved in gangs and other behavioral challenges. These children tend to go on to complete more years of education, earn more in the workforce, and have a greater likelihood of getting married and becoming productive members of society. There is nothing that outstrips, in terms of a child's prospects for life, than a two-parent family. Nothing. That's empirical. That's research. It's undeniable. And please, I want to just put it out there. I know that we live in a broken world, and there are some that come from or are in single-parent families. And, you know, I take my hat off to those who are doing that, because it's tough. And so it's not to negate that. It's just to show what is the ultimate in terms of advantage. And I also know that there are some families that are also dysfunctional. So, okay, so families and the idea of the two-parent privilege. And I'll show you the book where that comes from. It's an economic book. Then sexual restraint. So J.D. Unwin, he was a professor from Oxford and Cambridge, and he examined the data from 86 societies and civilizations over a period of 5,000 years of history. And he was investigating to see the relationship between sexual freedom and the flourishing of cultures. So when he was measuring the flourishing of cultures, he was looking at art, he was looking at architecture, he was looking at engineering, all aspects of culture and society. And what his research found, again, definitely not popular in this time of supposed sexual liberation, sex restraint before marriage and fidelity are key indicators of human flourishing. Sexual restraint and fidelity. Cultures that embraced monogamy for 3 or more generations exceeded all other societies and cultures. So, the most powerful combination of a flourishing social society culturally as well was prenuptial chastity coupled with absolute monogamy. Again, empirical research behind this. So some of the arguments with this whole queering is that it's progressive. We have to move forward. We've got to move away from these old things. But it's not progressive because some of the ideas, and the key idea is actually that intergenerational sex, which is the pedophilia, is not new. If you go to the Roman societies, the men would have young boys as their sex slaves until they became adolescents, and then they were allowed to get married, and that was normal. That was normal in those societies. They also, if you've read or interested in Francis Schaeffer, his book is How Should We Then Live? He also looks at the Roman society, and part of the falling of the Roman society was this absolute sexual unrestraint. Okay, so social flourishing comes from families, the two-parent privilege, and from sexual restraint. Remember that self-control as the underlying form of government. Political flourishing, limited state and justice. What's man's answer? Again, the state, elite-controlled big government. The aim is we're going to create a utopia here on earth through transforming society according to man on the throne. Because if God is not on the throne, then man is on the throne, and man will create this utopia. And therefore, man has to be in control, and we have this elite-controlled big government. So F.A. Hayek, he wrote a book called Fatal Conceit, and what he meant by that is the idea that man is able to shape the world around him according to his wishes, and it will go well. It will go well. So what is interesting in South Africa is the ANC heavily influenced from the 90s. So I first want to say the origins of the ANC are amazing. Missionary educated Christians, these were called the Kolwa, the Christian converts. They started schools, they started universities, they started newspapers. They infiltrated in terms of the community and helping it, supporting it. Amazing. I call them the constitutional Democrats. And then from the 1960s, the ANC becomes strongly influenced because of, during the apartheid, from the communist influence with the proxy Cold War, which was being played out on the African continent, and the influence in particular of the Soviet Union. And one of the ideas that they exported, it's foreign, into South Africa is the idea of the Vanguard Party. It's a Leninist idea, and it comes from the idea that the elite actually knows better. So your working class, actually, they should rule. We should have them rule. But they have false consciousness. They don't actually know what they don't know. So what you have is the Vanguard Party, which will think for you. So if you go and you look inside the ANC documents of today, they speak about themselves being the Vanguard Party, the one that rules. So it's that same thing of that elite government. They will make the decisions for us. So the aim is then, obviously, the elite knows better. They will have total control. And eventually that goes into totalitarianism. And it's that idea of the omnicompetence of the state, that the state can do everything, knows everything. All knowledge is centralized inside of the state. And it effectively begins to intrude into the private realms and becomes prescriptive and coercive, especially around beliefs, norms, and values. So it actually moves out of its lane, and then it goes into all the other lanes in terms of governance. So it goes into the family government, it goes into church government, it goes into the market government, and it takes over everything, and it starts to totally control. And we see this happening not just in South Africa, but in the world. The hate speech bills, intruding into people's thoughts and thinking, becoming prescriptive around what you're allowed to say and speak and think. the Non-Conversion Acts, the Bella Bills, etc. This is a worldwide phenomenon. And what is particularly concerning is that the state is the beholder of the coercive arm. So it actually holds the arm to punish. So you've got the legislation. So when you start to legislate, you're actually giving it the aim to kind of work with the sword to actually, because it holds coercion. So it's deeply, deeply concerning. What is God's idea of the state and state government? He gives it a limited, specified role of state government. So we see this in Romans 13, where the state is supposed to be the servant of God for the good of all people. So when I teach this, I teach on good governance. So good governance versus bad governance. Good governance means you are other regarding. So you go into office in order to consider what is in the public's interest. So it's called impartiality. So you govern on the basis of impartiality. You are not moved by your personal interests, your party interests, or your private interests. And this is a very biblical principle. It's actually in our Constitution, which is quite incredible. So Romans 13 verses 4 says that for he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So it's this derived authority. Human government is a derived authority. Those who are sitting in civil government are supposed to be servants of God, so they're accountable to God. They're ministers of God, so their authority is also limited, and they can also be removed by God, as you would have heard in reading Daniel. So such derived and limited authority is to be exercised for good of all people. And we can discuss about, in terms of how do we engage with this kind of authority. So although authority, God is not a God of disorder, so he is a God of order, and he gives us these structures for order and for flourishing. But because he appoints these authorities, it doesn't mean that he approves of all they do. So in the same way, as parents, although parents and family government is an institution given by God, it doesn't mean that he approves of everything that we do as parents. In the same way, just because he appoints those who are in authority, it doesn't mean he approves of everything those do. And it's not as if when you become a state official, all of a sudden you became benignly good. And yet somehow we don't want to hold those who are in government accountable. So this, again, is a looking back to how society was. So in your society during the time of ancient Israel, they were completely unique to the other societies around them, where, for example, you will know with Egypt, with the pharaohs, where the pharaohs were considered to be semi-divine, if not divine, because they were actually God on earth, and you didn't in any way question them. Their word was law. But if you look at the leaders of Israel, they were recognized to be fallible people. So the kings were required to read, it wasn't then the Bible, but the writings, the Torah, they were required to read it constantly. Why? So that they would know that they are not God. So completely different from the societies around them where human authorities were considered to be divine or semi-divine, and without ways of, they were obviously, their words were law and they were not held accountable. So when we start moving back, we're moving back to that way of society. Again, it's not progress, it's regress. So what is the role of the state? Is to execute justice. It bears a sword. And in that way, it actually is supposed to bring order through justice. So Isaiah 30 says the Lord is a God of justice. Justice is getting what you deserved applied impartially. So here is a picture of justice. This is Lady Justice, and she has that, I always forget what this thing is around this blindfold. And the reason why it is that when she's judging, so justice is supposed to be impartially applied. So you're judging on the case. What am I hearing? What happened? I'm not judging in terms of the person that's standing before me. I'm not judging them in terms of their class. Are they poor? Are they rich? I'm not judging them. Are they male or female? I'm not judging them on any of those social indicators. I'm purely judging on the basis of the case. And that is what the state is supposed to do. It's supposed to judge impartially. Leviticus 19 verses 15 says, do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. Proverbs 29 verses 4 says, by justice a king gives a country stability, but tears it down by accepting bribes. Have we not just seen that? By justice a king gives a country stability, but tears it down by accepting bribes. Ecclesiastes 8 verses 11 says, why do people commit crime so readily? Because crime is not punished quickly enough. And this is the role of the state. Peace is not an absence of conflict. It's the presence of justice. But we want to extend that role of the state into the goodie bag. And this is the problem that we have in South Africa. We expect too much, and we also are lured by the promises of these parties of too much. But a government big enough to give you everything you want is strong enough to take everything you have. So let's bring it home. And let's get practical. I must say I'm very excited about these elections. I'm cautiously optimistic. So in the last 2 evenings, I've been sitting on panels in Joburg and in Pretoria, and we were discussing elections. And you just get a sense that people sense this is something different. It feels like another 1994 moment. Whereas people have become complacent, all of a sudden there's an energy that is like never before around election. I've never experienced anything like this. Just a real excitement. So, please don't be surprised. There are some new things to expect. It's nothing to worry about. People are all like, the independence. It really hasn't changed a lot. All it means is you're going to get 3 ballot papers. So when you go in there, you're going to be voting on a national level. When you vote nationally, you are voting, you're just going to see political parties. Then you're going to vote regionally. So we've got a National Assembly, 400 seats. 200 of those seats come from that national ballot, and then another 200 seats come from the regional ballot. On that regional ballot, you will also, it's actually provincial representatives, but it's not your provincial legislature. And they will also sit as part of those 200 seats, and there you will have independents as well. And then you're going to have a provincial ballot, and that is obviously just for your province. And on that, you will also see independents. So just practically, that's what you're going to see. Independents are something new, so you're going to actually see people's names. This was a legal case which was fought and won. So if there's somebody who you know is of good character, then you can actually hold them accountable because you actually know who their names are. So, but some of the things that we hear, and it is the bigger parties that do it, if you vote for a small party, your vote is going to be lost. And we need a big majority to, the big fight and that fear-mongering. I want to encourage you that because we have a proportional representation PR system, what it means is that the number of votes that a party receives, that proportion is they get that in terms of the seats. So it's called proportional. So they get the percentage of votes that they receive, proportionally they will get those seats. We have a very low threshold of 0.25 is I think one of the lowest thresholds. So it's actually fairly easy to get a seat. Now I've looked on the national list, there's about 52 parties there. You're going to look at some of them and you're going to go, I've never heard of them before. So please don't go and vote for them because then probably your vote will not count. But we've got many smaller parties who have actually stayed the line, who have actually made an impact. And if you want to look at this and you actually want to see what do they stand for, the Parliamentary Monitoring Group. So a lot of our students actually work there and they actually go and take notes. So when they're in these portfolio committees, they are debating, they mirror the ministries and they take notes of what those representatives, those parliamentary representatives are doing on those portfolio committees. And you can actually see what these representatives are doing and saying. And so you can measure up, okay, you said this, but what did you do when they were actually debating the Bella Bill? What did you say when the Bella Bill was being debated inside your portfolio committee? And you can go and you can look and see what they're doing. So the thing with smaller parties is the other side is, okay, so out of 400, when eventually the bill is going through, because we've still got dominant party, if the ANC has decided, it will go through. But we're going to start, we are moving into more competitive elections, so you've got to remember that those smaller parties are inside those portfolio committees. So from, yes, maybe 6 out of 400 or 10 out of 400 is not many, but you go into a portfolio committee out of 10 and you are 1 out of 10, but you are the expert in that area. All of a sudden, people inside that committee are listening to you. So you've got to think about when you are voting, who do you want inside those portfolio committees? Who represents your interests and you want them making those decisions where the real debating happens, where the real legislature is actually drafted and debated and rewritten and then held to account. So I want to encourage you, please don't be put off by this idea that your vote is lost, because it's actually not true. We don't have a constituency-based system where it's a winner-takes-all, and if you don't get, if you have, like, say, Party A that gets 60% of the vote and Party B gets 40%, Party A wins everything and that other 40% is lost. We don't have that system. We have a PR system. So your vote counts. Your vote counts. And I encourage you, we have done voting on the basis of fear in South Africa. It did not go well. Let's not do this one again. We are not supposed to vote on the basis of fear. So vote on the basis of faith. And that's why I've presented what empirically and also biblically makes for a flourishing society. Go and evaluate those political parties, because you are not just seeking your prosperity, you're seeking the prosperity of the country in which we find ourselves. And go and evaluate those parties. So I also wanted to show you this. I'm hoping this will actually encourage you. So this is, when we get election results, we get the results from those who register to vote and then those who turn out. So we will hear, like in the last elections, the ANC won with 57% of the vote. The DA got, I think, 22 or 21% of the vote. But the more meaningful figure is this, and this is called the voting eligible population. This is every South African citizen, 18 and older, who is eligible to vote. Not those who necessarily go out and register and those who go and vote. In the last elections, 51% of the voting eligible population did not go out and vote. 51%. Can you imagine if we can mobilize people to go and vote? We could change everything. The ruling party, the ANC, they won on the basis of 28% of the voting eligible population. 28%. Those who voted for the DA, 10% of the voting eligible population. So more people did not vote than those that voted. As an American politician said, to not vote is not a protest. It is a surrender. And this is the government structure that we have. We have a democratic government structure, which means that we actually are citizens with rights and responsibilities in this country. So we have a right to elect those who are going to represent us, but we also have a responsibility to elect and to vote wisely. How do you measure? Self-government, character. Do they manage their finances? Do they manage their family? Do they manage themselves? So we have ways in which to measure this and to see this. And then competence. Can they govern? So here are some resources There are lots of resources at the moment. Obviously, with the Wilberforce Academy, you can also see in the Wilberforce Academy, you go to our website, there are resources on there. The Association of Christian Media has got a Vote Your Values campaign with numerous resources on there. Freedom of Religion for South Africa has got a religion voting scorecard. You've got Time to Rise, and this is their scorecard. So they've got values which we would consider important, biblical values, and then how do the various political parties, do they represent those values? So people have done lots of hard work, but you can go and you can look for yourselves and see the different parties and see where do they stand in terms of what are values that make for flourishing societies. And then there's the South African Voters Guide. And then you can go and have a look at the candidate lists on the IEC's or the Electoral Commission's website and see the different parties and candidates and the parties and candidates that are nationally, regionally, and then also provincial. And for those of you who are interested, there's a really good book. Those of you who like politics or who would like to know more about politics, Joseph Boot, Ruler of Kings. I can really recommend that as a resource. So in summary, God is sovereign. He is king. He is sovereign over all of this. And so we can also sigh a deep sigh of relief. Yes, the 29th of May is important. It's really important. But God is still on the throne no matter what. So no matter what happens, he's still king. He's still sovereign. You know, Jesus died and he is risen and he's seated on the right-hand side of God above all principalities and powers. And that is where our hope and our trust lies. It does not lie in human institutions, and it does not lie in the state. Even so, we are here, we are in this world, and we should be seeking the flourishing of the society in which we find ourselves. So he's devolved responsibility into sphere sovereignty. We've got these different forms of governance, and if we're going to see economic flourishing, we need a free market, we need good stewardship, we need the protection of property, we need the extension of property rights. And if we're going to see social flourishing, it's families, it's sexual restraint, political flourishing. We need to recognize civil government as a form of government that is limited in its jurisdiction. And we need to limit it. And its primary responsibility is justice. Just imagine, I was talking to someone the other day, and she was saying that she's a healthcare worker, and she has to leave sometimes at 10 o'clock at night. And she said she has to go out on those roads. And I said, imagine if the state provided you with justice and you knew that you were safe when you got on those roads, then you would gladly go and do your job. We would gladly open up businesses until 10 at night if we had a pizzeria. We would gladly walk the streets. We would gladly send our kids to schools without fences around them if they were secure, if the state did its primary responsibility, which is justice and security. So I encourage you to vote from an informed position based on what makes for a flourishing society, and then seek and pray for the peace and the prosperity of the city in South Africa in which you find yourselves.